All right, well, let's welcome everybody this morning. Thank you for giving up your valuable time to share it with four people, three of who are wonderful and one is pretty average, and I speak that average session, that average person being myself, because in the company of these esteemed gentlemen, it's very easy to look inadequate. So this morning, we're going to look at dissecting the security implications of the Australian Critical Infrastructure Act. It's going to have significant impact, impost. Some may say even burden, some say cost implications, but I think it's designed for a purpose, and we need to better understand what that purpose is and look at how it's going to affect the way that we go forward, both as an entity, as an individual, and as a nation, and understand some of, as we pull it apart, some of the things perhaps we need to explore and get a better appreciation of. So I'd like to thank very much Nozomi Networks for sponsoring this morning. Nozomi do pride themselves on being thought leaders in this space and can bring into the Australian environment and Asia Pac even insights that, to somewhat challenge the paradigm of conventional thinking, because we don't actually stretch ourselves in the earliest opportunities with some of the conversations on these issues. We find ourselves reacting too much, whereas if we can push that little bit of strategic stretch, then we're going to better position ourselves. So congratulations to Nozomi for that. If I could introduce the panel this morning, Professor Jonathan Rusch, all the way from the US, formerly a prosecutor with the US Department of Justice, the whiz kid of Nozomi, Diego Betancur. Thank you for joining us, Diego. Bill Hagestad, retired Lieutenant Colonel of the US Marines, expert in Chinese cyber espionage. Great to see you again, Bill. So if I could just ask people, please contribute some questions. We'll try to get to them along the way. So if you go into the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen, throw your questions in there, and I'll throw them up to the panel as we go. Far more interesting and engaging if you participate at every opportunity. So let's kick off. This piece of legislation, the Australian Critical Infrastructure Act, has mandated as one of its imperatives that under its umbrella, we're now taking the national critical infrastructure focus from 4 key spheres of operation to 18, and estimated the number of entities affected will arise from 167 to over 1,700. This is massive. Gentlemen, why do you think the Australian government deems this step as necessary?
Well, Brian, I think it's necessary because the threat surface out there in just one critical infrastructure area is significant enough that the Australian government is looking at this as a taxonomy of all critical infrastructure and the threats that will face the country from a holistic perspective. And if you don't have an understanding of the critical infrastructure that you're protecting, that threat surface, as a country, it becomes much more difficult to organize effectively to defend that when the need arises.
Okay, so let's go back to the one step, though. They've mandated that they've got to protect it, but the question is, why do they need to protect it? And I know that seems a rhetorical question, but what is it we're not being told that necessitates this significant piece of legislation being created?
Brian, I think part of the issue here is that, I have to give credit to the Australian government for taking this kind of step. Many countries have been seeing, with the variety and increasing sophistication of threat actors coming from many different dimensions, nation-state actors, organized criminal groups of various sorts, positioned all over the globe. And in some respects, both categories, the nation-state actors and the organized crime groups, are agnostic as where they can get benefits from acquiring key military intelligence, economic intelligence, other kinds of data that can be useful to them either to improve their own information technology or to get strategic leverage in different kinds of geopolitical scenarios. And the reality is, as we see in a growing number of countries around the globe, more and more deliberate and sophisticated attacks are being launched against many aspects of critical infrastructure. So, you mentioned this point about the increase of the umbrella of national critical infrastructure But I think it's fair to say that we've got to look at all of those areas, not just one or two like traditional services, gas, electricity, water, but everything on which the functioning of our daily lives and business operations depend. And so I think, honestly, it makes a good deal of sense to make sure that you've got a comprehensive approach where you're looking at every critical aspect of critical infrastructure and making sure that you have a coherent framework to approach how to improve cybersecurity across the board, recognizing the variety and the sophistication of many of the threat actors who comb the globe daily for new information, new access, and sometimes testing to see whether key infrastructure components can be breached.
I think you raise a couple of points there, and one is you've got the issue of convergence by the criminal element, and I think we touched on there before. Are they state, nation-sponsored threat actors? Are they lone wolves? Are they hacktivists? Are they organised crime? And I think history tells us now that these are actors, depending on the motivation at any point in time, can perform a variety of roles and functions to pursue whatever that outcome may be. I mean, we had the announcement by the Prime Minister last year, 2020, that, I don't know, midway nearly through the year, that said Australia was under sophisticated cyber attack. I mean, for those of us in the industry, that wasn't anything absolutely startling, but it was a wake-up call. Now, do you think that there is an appreciation of the threats so far now that they realise, hang on, how do we drag more of Australia into this and actually start to set standards? And my question is, they've increased it from 4 to 18. Is it inevitable that it's going to go increase beyond that so we get a true national standard of cybersecurity on every level within our community in this country?
Yeah, I might take that. But yeah, Brian, yeah, good point. And on basically on why the bill exists, obviously it's also about protecting our economy as well. And obviously, with recent events, we have seen that expansion, obviously, into food, groceries, and other areas that you mentioned. And to your point, why is that expansion? Well, the actual bill has some important insights of, like 1/3 of all the incidents reported to the SCSC came from critical infrastructure entities. Obviously, there's a lot of unreported incidents to the SCSC, and obviously when we had before with the 2018 Act, there was still some of entities in national significance that had mandated to do that reporting, but it still is that 1/3 of the incidents came from the critical infrastructure, and that's the this bill definition of critical infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks for bringing the conversation back to what we're supposed to be talking about. Okay, so thanks for that, because it's easy, and maybe we'll get towards the end some of the more expanded. I can just see this permeating far more than what's being declared at the moment. And let's just bring to the fore, we've all seen that recent attack on that water treatment facility in Florida. And whilst it may have been a simple process to get within that network and then change the levels of chemicals that would have gone into the water supply, the fundamental issue for me was that we have a part of critical infrastructure being targeted to absolutely cause harm. So can we realistically expect more instances of this sort of behavior? And throw it out there. Bill.
Oh, absolutely. I think from a positive perspective, I have to back up to something that Diego mentioned. The fact that the Australian government has mandated this really essentially tells every Australian to be a human firewall. What that means with that level of awareness that they're creating means that even though there are sophisticated actors that will come after these 18 areas of critical infrastructure, at least there is an awareness. What that means then is that the attackers or the adversaries will have to be much more skillful in terms of the ways that they approach or create avenues of approach to essentially attack or degrade or deny the ability of Australia to use these areas of critical infrastructure. They will continue to test Australia now, especially that you've announced that you have this piece of legislation. they will come fast and furious. And that's where the community of whole becomes so important. One of the other areas that Diego touched on and teased us with a little bit is the reporting requirement of companies. If you look in the legislation specifically, it says 12 hours for nascent and 72 hours for reporting vulnerabilities. What that means then is as you have adversaries hit the critical infrastructure, this is essentially fleeted or notified up to the governing bodies within the Australian Signals Directorate, so they can essentially communicate that across all areas so everybody's aware of that threat. That's one of the things that has developed successfully here in the United States, and I'm happy to see it coming to fruition in Australia.
Yeah, Brian, one thing I'd add here, though, if I can quote your literal language back to you, you said, can we expect to see more instances like this? What happened in Florida was actually, by my reckoning, a very unsophisticated kind of attack. It exploited very simple kinds of deficiencies in the targeted system's own IT infrastructure. They had an outdated version of Windows, weak cybersecurity network, and in the end, not much happened other than the person changing the sodium hydroxide levels very briefly. That was recognized almost immediately. I think the problem that larger enterprises, especially ones possessed of critical infrastructure, have to think about is that the more sophisticated actors aren't going to telegraph their punches. You're not going to see them coming if you fail to upgrade and constantly maintain the strength of your cybersecurity. You know, if you look at what happened with Stuxnet, with the hypothetical U.S. and Israeli government participation in that, or what happened very recently in the U.S. with the SolarWinds attack, nobody recognized on the target end until far too late that they had actually been completely compromised by very sophisticated attackers with very sophisticated techniques. So I think part of what we have to anticipate here, using the Florida wastewater treatment plant as a simple example, is to say, we've got to look for the low-hanging fruit. We've got to also prepare for the much more sophisticated attackers and identify them and identify the kinds of techniques they're using so that we really can protect critical infrastructure in a meaningful way on a continuing basis. And that's going to be a genuine challenge for lots of enterprises across Australia.
So, but does the Florida example actually provide a perfect example of why this legislation is needed? Because what it is doing is forcing the infrastructure industry, as we traditionally know it, to wake up and take notice. They've been pushed into a position out of necessity. And what the Florida thing tells to me is it was unsophisticated because it could be. They didn't have to be sophisticated because the security had not been taken seriously by that organization. There had been no investment into the IT and the OT security processes. And therefore, is this a move by government to say broadly to the industry, you now have to take cybersecurity seriously, and a way of forcing that uplift and in maturity? Diego?
Yeah, I would say one, obviously for us here in Australia, one of the key lessons learned and one of the principles of the legislation is, you know, if the entity which now comes under the scope of this bill will be in this scenario, will you be prepared to share information with the government? And I'm sure we're going to touch on, you know, a key point, which is what is the powers now given to the government in an incident response, which is, you know, there was a lot of feedback from the industry on that. But yeah, one key thing is if that will happen to us, to our organization here in Australia, and we'll have to share with the government or other regulatory bodies, where is our preparedness going to be? Where are we at the moment with that?
I'd certainly agree with Diego and Brian on those points. I think it's good that this kind of specific attack really has helped to be a wake-up call, and certainly not just in Australia. You know, my concern, as I indicated, though, is that if part of the task of really upping the game of cybersecurity in Australia for all critical infrastructure sectors, people are going to have to recognize that it's not just the easy, simplistic attacks you have to defend against. Your CISOs, your information security teams are going to have to be geared up to be monitoring threat intelligence for the more sophisticated kinds of cyber attackers, not just the kind of clumsy, low sophistication attacks that happen to exploit very almost primitive kinds of deficiencies in the cybersecurity profile of that particular wastewater treatment place.
Yeah, well, I think but let's keep in mind they're going from 4 elements to 18 elements, and it's really very expanded. And once upon a time, critical, infrastructure was looking at, with a lot of focus on the sort of the OT environment, where now even we know with an organization there's a lot of IT overlay the OT. And now by the sheer inclusion of up to 18 different parts of the Australian environment and these sectors, that there's a hell of a lot going to be dragged up into it. Is this, the acceptance by the Australian government that we don't want to delineate anymore. We want to actually make an inclusive approach rather than exclusive.
I'll make one initial point maybe to open the conversation on that, and is to denote that obviously, even though is one bill, one scope, there's different layers. So, for example, the government says, systems of national significance and those critical infrastructure assets, and they both will have different sort of a scope, whether it's positive security obligations or enhanced security obligations and fines and so on. So, yeah, there is a lot of different industries in there, and they have, in terms of cybersecurity, very different levels of maturity. So yeah, we see obviously water and other the likes of in food, groceries, and banks in the same legislation.
It's interesting because it's pulling in so many other industries, and we don't have answers yet as to, well, who's going to be affected and how am I going to be affected? There's a question that's come through as a medium-sized chartered accounting firm, which would then, by definition, fall under the financial services space. The question is, how are we affected by the Act? And quite honestly, at this point in time, am I mistaken by saying we don't really know? It's almost like an intent. So it would imply, back to what you just articulated there about the enhanced security obligations and the positive security obligations, they have yet to be worked out. And I'd like to think there'll be a significant effort, I'm sure, happening behind the scenes as we currently speak, to give guidance on what those issues are. And it'll be a case of watch this space. Do you agree?
Well, Brian, go ahead, Diego, sorry.
Yeah, certainly. Just on that point of, and a lot of feedback from the industry, and especially for the government to clarify what will fall under critical infrastructure assets. Yeah.
Okay. Now, there's another question thrown here. How do you rate the level of understanding of this Act in the public sector corporate Australia, given most companies struggle with the Privacy Act and the notifiable data breach scheme? Is this just another burden for companies to get familiar with? Or, let me just throw that a little bit, another thing, or is it an opportunity?
Well, Brad, I'd say, frankly, it's both. One of my longstanding concerns with regard to cybersecurity generally is that even when you have companies that say, oh, yes, we don't understand, we have to protect our data, we have to protect our consumers or customers' personal information, I think there's still, in some corporate sectors, an expectation that like cybersecurity is something where, if you just throw some money at them for a while, they can go, find some problems here and there and, basically fix a wall by spackling it over a little bit and all is well. I think at all sizes of companies in many countries around the world, there's a failure on the part of non-technical expert C-level executives to understand just how demanding the process of maintaining cybersecurity is at present, given the increasing sophistication and variety of cyber actors. And if you have this impression that, cybersecurity is just something that, you can throw a bit more money at here and there, that's a real problem. I think more corporate executives, and this is certainly, I think, true of Australia as it is the United States and other countries, really need to be made to understand in non-technical language how severe the threats can be I mean, how devastating they can be to your business processes, to your ability to operate, and so on. And so, yes, it's an opportunity to the extent that the legislation says, nope, all of you shape up here in these critical infrastructure sectors because we, the government, deem it important. But it is important. It is important that more and more corporates recognize that this is an essential feature of protection of their business. Like nobody would say, let's just, throw away our fences and our locks to protect our physical plants from any kind of injury. And yet, I think too many executives still take for granted the notion that, cybersecurity is something that those geeks do, that those people who have, some kind of strange language between themselves, and we don't understand it, but, if we just tell them to go do things, they'll take care of the problem. More non-technical experts need to get into the fray and really embrace the notion that this is about protecting the integrity and the ability to do business of their various enterprises. So to the extent that they feel burdened by this, it's a necessary burden in broad terms.
Okay, so how does the Australian legislation compare to the US legislation, John?
Well, that's an easy comparison, Brian. For those of you from Australia, let me offer this comparison. The Australian Critical Infrastructure Act provides a uniform approach created by the national government, and obviously there's a great deal of implementation still to be done. But if you think of it this way, the situation in the United States is at a polar opposite from Australia. Despite multiple administrations in the US government, there is still no consistency of approach, no, this must be done, as opposed to, it would be really good if everybody would get behind the banner of cybersecurity and do more things. My analogy would be, for Australians, imagine if you were asked to play in a game of Australian rules football, where you have not 7, but 50 and more different umpires, each with a different rule book, who can penalize the players who step onto the field for any one of the violations that they see in their rule books. And there has to be no consistency between the rule books, and where the owners of the teams don't even want to shell out enough money to give the players proper footwear. That's the kind of fragmented, disjointed, asymmetrical kind of approach that we have currently in the United States, and where PS, some of our best efforts by law enforcement only come in after the damage has occurred, and then you bring in the investigators to try to figure out why the catastrophic event happened.
So did someone from the Federal Attorney General's Department actually sponsor you to come on and share this insight with us today? You've given them a hell of a rap. And thank you. I mean, that's what people want. It's comforting to know, that we are exploring new territory, but we think we're behind the States, but what you're saying is this approach is far superior.
I think so, quite genuinely, Brian. I mean, everybody has been reticent for years and years about getting the government too much into the business of the internet and how things are regulated and how cybersecurity should work. And unfortunately, we continue because we are a federal system in the United States. We have individual states that have competence, at least, in technical or legal terms, competence to regulate. The federal government can regulate, but there's been a lot of resistance from multiple sectors. And so nothing has happened that brings us to the kind of point that the Australian government now has with the Critical Infrastructure Act. I'm sure that there are going to be, from different quarters, different complaints about how you actually execute against the obligations of the Critical Infrastructure Act. But in my estimation, as a nation, Australia is already better off, because at least now you have a chance to say, here are the tweaks we need to have sector by sector, but everybody in the critical infrastructure space has to step up. It's not just, wouldn't it be nice to do, it's these things need to be done.
Well, I think
historically are lagging behind.
Yeah, I think historically in Australia, we've got a fairly consistent record of failing in the I code of things. you know, the idea of the I code, that our telcos would actually eradicate the botnets by withholding services until someone cleaned their machine, failed. The industry would voluntarily provide notifications of data breach, failed. And it's only when acts have been put in place and the legislation is there, sadly, we've seen the step up to the mark, generally speaking, which has then given us more information. So this could be part of that program. But here's a sounds again like a rhetorical question, but do you think the government is possession of information that makes this legislation an absolute imperative, Bill?
Yes, actually, Australia is at war. If you think back to 1939 and the collective effort that your country faced in the South Pacific, right now, based on this legislation, everyone is running to the borders to get on a ship to go and fight the adversary where they think they are. But however, the government with this legislation is saying, enemy and the threat is within our borders. Let's now figure out how to put up a firewall with true governance, risk, and compliance that has been alluded to by the other two speakers, and figure out where we can fix and place those adversaries before they impact our critical infrastructure. No other country is going to come and save you this time, unfortunately. The US can't do it. It'll have to be a homegrown Australian effort, and that is the beauty of it, because you can do it correctly, do it accurately, take the good and the bad from other countries. There is a comment or a question in the question box saying, well, where do we even start with this? You've heard Jonathan talk about some of it from a legislative perspective and Diego from a practical perspective. But I will tell you, in the US, we have a presidential executive order from 2013. I've mentioned this before, is the advent and creation of information sharing analysis centers, ISACs. That, in my estimation and recommendation, would be what each one of the 18 critical areas of infrastructure should do. And perhaps Nozomi sets up a template for this and offers this to the critical infrastructure.
Because no pressure, Diego.
Yeah, no pressure. Yeah, but that way, because within the Australian legislation for protecting the infrastructure is the notion that vulnerabilities, as I mentioned before, at a tactical perspective, will need to be shared. This is very much like sharing intelligence in a wartime position. You now need to figure out where the adversary is and share that information when it hits part of that critical infrastructure, so that all will become stronger. Back over to you, Brian.
Yeah, on my questions.
If I might just take one step back on your previous point. Here, number one feedback from the industry on that consultation was, we don't want overlapping legislation. We have, federal and state, and I'm assuming that's coming mainly from, a lot of banks and the traditional, they fall into the more mature cybersecurity space. However, for other parts that have not been matured traditionally, the likes of energy, food, grocery, health, transport, water, it's to Jonathan's point, it is an opportunity to get a common framework from the ground up and head into the right direction. And shout out obviously to Emo from the power industry. They have a community going. Their cybersecurity framework has been well received and adopted and aligned with NIST and the likes of the other ones.
Well, I think the way to there's two things got to happen. There's got to be due consultation by government with those industry groups, and there's got to be an acceptance of the risk by industry groups to invest in the due process. So, it can't be, well, you can't force that on us unless you pay for it. Well, you know what? That's not going to happen. But what's going to happen is you're going to have to step up if you want a license to operate that sort of industry in this space, because we're declaring it now as part of national critical infrastructure. And you can just see, once you open the doors to our politicians and legislators to solve our problems, that door will never close. It continues to remain open and will continue to become more complex. But I'd like to come back to that issue, because there are issues you raised, Diego, that I know the financial sectors are going to be talking about CPS 234. We've got the data breach schemes and the like. But I want to come back to you, Bill, is that China has its Belt and Road program and the Chinese Military Center of Cyber Excellence. What does that mean for Australia's critical infrastructure community, especially in light of we've fallen out of favour with China? We've had significant financial and business interruptions to different parts of our homegrown industries here.
Yeah, let's unpack that. There's two components, well, actually three, and really the impact and effect on Australia is quite dire, not to be a naysayer or negative Nelly. 2015, the Chinese government, the Communist Party, announced the One Belt, One Road, which is essentially a maritime version of the old Silk Road that Marco Polo effected from Italy and Europe across the sands of Europe and across to China. What that means to the Chinese is essentially they are putting up in deep water ports in countries such as Malaysia, Sri Lanka, even the Middle East, these essentially, state-owned enterprises that are running the shipping concerns. Along with those civilian components from an economic perspective are People's Liberation Army cyber units forward deployed. Every time that I've gone over there, that's one of the things that they are so jealous of us as Americans, is that they have not had the opportunity to deploy forward. Now they have made that excuse as it relates to these cyber centers of excellence. So they're forward projecting these cyber warriors, and they're very well trained in order to protect the state-owned enterprises such as shipping concerns and other economic entrails that go along with that shipping. What is the impact and effect of Australia? Well, it puts that attacker from an offensive perspective that much closer to your infrastructure. What's perhaps damning is you're not going to be able to then tell precisely, even if it is outside of a question of attribution, where those military attackers are coming from. Are they activists? Are they in somebody's basement? Or are they actually full-blown military attackers coming to look at your infrastructure, probe it? If we look what happened to India, although the Indians are denying it, the Chinese perhaps probed their infrastructure and brought part of it down as a part to demonstrate that they could indeed do it. That may be far off as a doomsday type of scenario, but if someone else is experiencing it, Australia should plan for that to happen to them.
Yeah, look, I don't think it's doomsday at all. I think it's just a simple pill called reality, and we need to take it with a big glass of water and say, okay, how do we prepare? And full kudos to the Australian government, because I see this as a step as part of that preparation to actually protect the community. And as John, you articulated so well before. And really, I just wonder, has the debilitating effect of COVID-19 on the nation's economy cemented the drive and commitment by government to get this legislation enacted?
Well, Brian, I can certainly anticipate that, as with so many other areas of government activity, it had to be a driver of these kinds of things. I would expect, however, and this goes back to, I think, a couple of points that Bill made earlier, I would have to think that in part because of Australia's participation in the Five Eyes, there are bits and pieces of intelligence being shared among the Five Eyes that don't make the headlines, that don't have necessarily the same eye-catching aspects as some of these, big kind of splashy cyber breaches and so on. But I would have, ample reason to think that Australia, through its contact with the Five Eyes, and more generally with the intelligence communities with which it connects around the globe, have to be especially aware of how motivated and sophisticated some of the more adversarial states are around the globe. And so COVID, in effect, is a driver or an enhancer of the attention that must be paid to cybersecurity and critical infrastructure. But I'm willing to bet that COVID is not the main driver of that.
No, I think it may have galvanized or steeled their resolve to support this legislation in the event we've seen by COVID. How, you take one element of operation out of a community and all of a sudden the results can be quite debilitating. And whilst I have you, John, in this legislation, we see these terms like positive security obligations and enhanced security obligations. Why is it that legislators like to introduce new vernacular that throws everything out? Is it to confuse us, or tell her they're smarter than the rest of us and they want to use new words we haven't experienced yet? Terms?
Well, Brian, I have to say at the outset that, as a practicing lawyer, lawyers love to see legislators adopt new terms, new catchphrases, because it means there are more opportunities then for we lawyers to interpret those kinds of new and unfamiliar terminologies to paying clients.
So if I could just interrupt there for a moment. So what you're saying is most of the technology companies out there, their marketing teams are ex-lawyers. Sorry, Marie, if you listen to this. Because I mean, you know, what do you think their intent with these terminologies, positive and enhanced security obligations?
Yeah. Well, let me make a serious point on this, Brian. I think in a way, as I looked at the act itself, kind of went through it cover to cover, I thought, well, if the Australian government is saying we need to have specific obligations that we are requiring all of these participants in different sectors of critical infrastructure, you need to have something that says, here's the baseline, here's the minimum stuff that you need to do in managing the security and resilience of your critical infrastructure assets. And then some components of critical infrastructure are going to have greater challenges, greater obligations, and greater requirements. So, to my way of thinking, even though positive security obligations versus enhanced security obligations might sound a little bit odd or a little bit strained, you've got to label the things that you were telling the private sector to do, and doing it in a way that there's at least some basic typology to say, this is the minimum stuff that we will expect you to do. And for some of you, there will be enhanced requirements.
Yeah. Diego, you wrote a comprehensive blog on the legislation. Is that on the Nozomi website, or are you able to send a link to all the registrants here today so they can view that?
I'm sure Marie can put it on the chat. But bringing back to those terms, independently of if it's lawyers' terms or not, I guess what it means for the operators is whether is a voluntary, they join voluntary, they're going to share information with the government, or whether now they have compliance and whether they have be fines for not compliance or loss of license, right? And that's where obviously the industry is asking for more clarifications on how is that interface gonna look like. And then on those who have to actually fines, and for example, like some of the recommendations on the papers, one really good one from the CRC was, if we put in fines and we're talking about positive obligation, why don't we incentivize with other things, the likes of tax breaks for those entities who actually start to align with this legislation and start to work together and up their game in cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think if the government wants us to fast track this nation's cybersecurity, there needs to be some reward for that effort by industry. And I think we need to get a little bit creative, innovative, everything that they expect industries to do. I think could be fast tracked if it was incentivized the right way. And let's face it, coming out of COVID, what a wonderful way if we could stimulate the economy in this space, right? Now, Diego, I know that you've also done a bit of analysis on some of the submissions, and there are a number of key issues that you think that people are out there in the community concerned about with this legislation coming in.
Yeah, and we touched a little bit on a few of those, but yeah, the main one is duplication of the legislation, where it's a state and federal, and another key one is what extent are the powers of the government, because obviously as part of the legislation they say they could step in if it's systems of national significance, and even to the point that they could even install their basically software in some of this. But but the government has come back with some, trying to still work in progress, trying to clarifying what is the extent, not to the fullest, but putting some check and balances in place when it's going to be that the government actually steps in. But I think what it means for everyone is to be, at minimum, just to be ready to share information, to have visibility of the OT networks.
Okay. Thank you. Look, we have not exactly, but roughly 16 minutes and 32 seconds left for this session. I think Aaron raises a good point in the chat that we need critical infrastructure to be prepared And we know that a lot are not prepared, and when that comes, they'll do the easy stuff first. And raises is the challenge too great to overcome. Where do we start? That's for you guys to answer, not, by the way. I'm asking the questions here today, okay? So jump in.
So Brian, from a fundamental perspective, there's actually a follow-on question by Josh in the chat that talks about focusing on the vendors that provide some of these network components or other OT systems, working along with them to ensure that security is built in by design. That is perhaps one of the fundamental steps, but you will know from my background in the Marine Corps, firms should be practicing as if they are under fire and under attack. Perhaps a simulated red teaming or a tabletop exercise would be just a very easy thing for an organization to do. That way you can overlay the governance, risk, and compliance lessons that you are expected to adhere to by the Australian government, find out where those gaps and pitfalls are, but really essentially look at the components from the endpoints all the way to the core of the network and find out if those systems have vulnerabilities that need to be patched. And if they're untenable or porous, replace them immediately.
So this is a process you've undertaken, I know, with entities in the United States and government and otherwise. And does that then provide you a good foundation of your next steps and prioritizing those activities, issues? Yes,
it absolutely does, because if you create the exercise correctly, you have all levels of the organization involved. Indeed, those that are at the C level or VP level act in their functional areas so they can feel the stress of being in a position of a data breach or an incident response type of program, and watching, for example, the incident response team at the corporate and the tactical level deal with these issues. Who to notify, what to do, who's doing this, how long have they been doing it, what's a background or a profile on this, and what are they after? When you simulate those types of attacks, you are essentially helping yourself learn from those lessons in what's called a hot wash, where everybody gives an opportunity to basically voice the lessons that they have learned. When you collect that amount of organizational information, you become stronger from the core, so that when you do face these types of adversaries in the real world, it's less like a surprise gotcha, but more of, hey, let's pull out the playbook that we talked about, exercise to the point that we have drilled to, and be successful defeating these adversaries.
Okay, thank you. And Diego, from a Nozomi perspective, if there were 3 things someone should start doing today or thinking about doing, what would they be?
Yeah, sure. And I'll connect it to, before I answer that question, also from Josh saying, is a problem that critical systems basically focus on service first and security second. And again, we're just talking about, we're talking about the water and power industry. We're talking about those system and automation systems that have been in place for 30 years, right? Like definitely no one was thinking about cybersecurity back then when they were designing up a substation in our country. So to answer your question, Brian, just visibility is key. So visibility of what's happening in these OT networks, take ownership of or start a program, back to Bill's point, like people, process, technology, start somewhere of taking ownership of that cybersecurity risk in the OT network. And finally, which is one of the principles of the bill is to the act is to be ready to share that information, whether it's going to be obviously compliance, but also with your community, right, within your sector that you operate on, and that might be obviously for those more mature, like the banks and the likes, but again, for many OT operators, it's not that obvious, and we're not there yet at that level of sharing, and we all have to do the part.
Okay, thank you. Keith makes a comment, why haven't we seen a serious successful attack on Australian infrastructure in the panel's view, given some of the old technology out there? I'll chip in just straight off that, and I'll invite the panel to speak. But in actual fact, Keith, we've had numerous examples, just sometimes it doesn't always make it into the public arena. Probably one of the first ones in the world that I can think of from dare I say, a cyber terrorism event, I use the term cyber loosely, was Vitek Bowden. It was an insider threat who released millions of raw effluent sewage into the Maroochy estuary and river system back about 20 years ago. devastating to the ecology and the local environment up there. But there are actually, our critical infrastructure entities have been breached numerous times. It just doesn't always make sense to let the world know about it. Anyone else would like to make comment on that?
Well, Brian, I can say from firsthand experience that the Vitek Bowden case really shook up things in the information security world in multiple countries on multiple continents. As primitive as that attack was, it at least underscored the possibilities that, it wasn't just about some 17-year-old hackers trying to mess around with individual computers or systems, but somebody who could actually harm society, who could harm critical processes on which everyday life depends. And that, for a time, really did help to open a lot of eyes in the corporate world and in the world of government cybersecurity expertise. But then I think it died down, and it's only in more recent years that now we see how much more sophisticated some of the attacks can be. So, with regard to Australia's situation, I think it's fair to say that Australia's had quite a bit of exposure to these kinds of risks. And to that extent, I think it's important to note that while it may seem burdensome at times, it really is an opportunity to step up to the realities of how the world of cybersecurity has to operate in 2021 and what the ramifications of that must be if, leading corporations and small and medium enterprises, all of them, want to maintain cybersecurity that's essential for the maintenance of critical infrastructure across the board.
I think there's a fundamental flaw, and please forgive me, Keith. I certainly don't mean to offend, but one of the problems we have, and it's actually typical of the question, is we want to apply it to the Australian geography or to the Queensland state or state of New South Wales or the local council of Maroochydore. And the problem is with cyber, as you know, there is no border or geography, and the motivations of whatever may inspire an actor to take a certain step upon a certain organisation can be many and varied. And the classic example I'll give you is, and I may have shared this on a previous webinar, but I remember when we first saw the FPOS terminals compromised at the McDonald's in Perth, the POS terminal. And it was compromised there, then the crooks then came over and they hit terminals in, they started doing their trade. Millions and millions of dollars worth of fraud in Melbourne, Sydney, and eventually we got them off the plane as they were arriving into Brisbane. And the essence of that story was, where I'm going with this, was that one of the big credit card companies had a chat with me. He said, "Oh yeah," he said, "we saw this happen in Norway and Scandinavia 2 years ago." And I thought, well, why didn't you tell us? Because the prevention of that from occurring in this country was very, very simple. And if we had known about it, we could have taken that lesson and applied it proactively. So we do fall into the trap of, and it becomes easy, especially when you talk about legislation, because it applies to an environment. We do get very tied down into assuming a geographical view, and thinking our offenders are local and our victims are local, and we just have to worry about local. But the reality is we're part of a global stage, and any lesson we can take in how do we actually look at building out from that global perspective, I think is a fundamental reality. Any other comments on that, Bill?
Yes, absolutely. From an international perspective, at the military and law enforcement and OGA, other governmental agency, I recall in several scenarios where people get into a very much a parochialism when it is either dealing with a threat or identifying defenses or offensive actions in cyberspace. And typically what happens is this concept called institutional ignorance, where you think that because you are American, for example, that you're impervious to being hacked back, and that your tool set is so great that no nation can possibly challenge it. I would advise and suggest, perhaps recommend in the most respectful way, that Australia do not fall into that trap. Understand the legislation, develop what is Australia's defensive mechanisms, and offensive when it will become necessary for the military to do so. You do not need to be like the United States, and by all means, don't be like us, be Australian. Seriously.
No, 100%. And, I'd rather watch our football than yours. Not that I don't appreciate your football, but it's there's a comment in there that, maybe we need to start developing a culture within this country of understanding and embracing cybersecurity. And I think it makes a very good point, because if it was in your cultural DNA, then we wouldn't be debating the necessity of this legislation, how it would apply so much, because we actually already be there. But when we still don't have a national curriculum for our kids in schools, and we have individual principals making a determination whether they'll include cyber safety as part of their curriculum or not, I think we've still got a long way to go. But let's not be too harsh, folks, because we've only had cyber for a few decades, and it's changing so quickly, and we are going through an evolutionary and transformational process that and having these conversations is what we should be doing, is challenging those paradigms of convention to look at and challenging the views. And that doesn't mean anyone's right or anyone's wrong. We're having a discussion. And I think debate is clearly the agenda on the table, and we'll be here for some time. So
Brian, if I might, one comment, I guess, and looking at the questions from the chat as well, like what the greatest threat for our critical infrastructure, and if there is more sort of fear that is ingrained into the industry. But part of the problem we discussed it today is the definition of critical infrastructure. I imagine some of you are thinking is, why hasn't something like what happened in Ukraine of the Triton likes or taking down the grid? One is obviously those systems actually have more resilience, like they built in sort of safety systems. Interesting on the bill, on the legislation itself, they put a case study on one of the sort of an attack, an incident on a power company here in Australia, and at the end they couldn't determine when that was coming from, the attacker, and but to the point is, we still have a lot of resilience in OT networks, but that risk profile is changing at the moment, right? With more connections, and there's many good professionals out there who knows their OT system really well, and they're asking for better resilience, better visibility in the networks, and those people need to be empowered and lifted into their cybersecurity capabilities.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of examples out there of the Australian mining industry, certain entities being under attack from pests and hacktivists and nation-sponsored threats. I mean, that's gone on for some time. Just this morning, I read a breach report that Malaysian Airlines have been breached for 9 years, and they've only just discovered they've been leaking data for 9 years. And you think about the importance of, now we know, especially from COVID, the importance of to our economy to have planes in the sky. But I think if I could just finish the last few minutes, gentlemen, I just want to revisit. We've got 18 sectors. Bill, you made a salient point there that of the need to share information. Diego, you also made the point about sharing intelligence. And I often talk about how do you build a trusted ecosystem. And I remember when I was sitting on the national, the Federal Attorneys Working Group on cybercrime, and we were developing the first plan to combat cybercrime. Key to that was actually engaging with partnerships, engaging with industry at the coalface. So no pressure, Diego, but I applaud Nozomi for having the gumption and insight to allow us to have this discussion today. But I think one of the ways it can fast track forward, and I think you touched on this, or might have been you, John, was how do we build ecosystems almost under each sector vertical, because many are so varied and different, they're not going to apply. And I think there's a role for vendors and the community, that would say the community of the business of cybersecurity, to don't wait back and sit back, start driving these discussions and be proactive about it. To me, a trusted ecosystem that gets the right information, that allows intelligence sharing from a global level, from governments to business. And I'm not talking about sharing the state secrets. That's not what it's about. I think, isn't that the logical path forward, or one of the key elements going forward?
Yeah, I'll answer that first. But yeah, key component, obviously, the legislation is collaboration and sharing information. One of the things they want to enhance more is the trusted information sharing network, so the TISN. But to your point, it's industry specific, and at the moment, a lot of operators don't know what that means. But we have seen good communities start forming. The water community, like, start to getting together and start to even sharing with the peers what it eventually would that mean in reality, that sharing information. But really key point.
Okay.
And I think, to pick up on Diego's point, Brian, I think that's the same kind of initiative that leading companies in the other critical infrastructure sectors need to follow. I think they just need to say, well, of course, we'll consult with government, but we haven't even established within our own industry bases of knowledge what we see as our critical vulnerabilities, what we see as our critical problems. And some of that can be a way forward if you say, obviously not sharing customer data or personal data, but just, can we at least share data that allows us to find out both where our cybersecurity systems have worked and instances where they haven't worked, or the threats that we're seeing, because simply within a particular industry sector, comparing notes to figure out that this is in fact, a set of threats that multiple companies in the same sector are experiencing is itself potentially one of the drivers for getting genuine coherence and genuine support sector by sector for doing something about these problems. In other words, don't wait for the government to convene you and then say, so, Brian, Bill, what do you think? Industry in the first instance should be in a position to say, we're not talking about sharing pricing data or other things that make lawyers' hair stand on end, but let's be candid with each other and find out, what have been our near misses? What have been our clear successes? And let's share that information so we can come to the table with government and have our own uniform or more uniform perspectives on what works or should work for us, rather than government just saying, well, you should do X, Y, and Z.
Gentlemen, we've come to the end of the hour. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for partaking in today and giving up your valuable time. I think it's been a brilliant conversation, and these things, they just go so fast. But I think, as I said before, once the door is open to regulatory reform, it never closes. And it's no much point just sitting back and criticising. We've got to get involved and be a part of it, because whilst this much maligned step in this evolutionary journey is often decried and abused, it's about how we as an industry embrace this as an opportunity and partner with the efforts of government to make a significant tactical and strategic difference, and focus on the outcomes, perhaps not so much the journey and the process, which, I always said, you're in a bureaucracy when the process is more important than the outcome. In the escalating complexity of this modern world, and the growing sophistication of those threats, we have to continue to grow and build our resilience by building a trusted ecosystem of valuable partners and good counsel that allows us to make better decisions tomorrow. So thank you very much for your time. A pleasure, distinct privilege always to share time with you, wonderful gentlemen. And thank you again to Nozomi Networks for having the foresight, the leadership, and the inspiration to put on these events. It's a credit to you. Have a great day.